One of the most important things that you can do when you assess your client is do a verbal assessment of what can possibly be causing them to have a lack of core control. Now, we've developed in the Perfect Practice Training System what we call the 1, 2, 3, 4 core assessment. And this assessment corresponds with the 4 parts of the core. So just as a quick review, the core unit is made up of the top of the core, which is our diaphragm, the front wall of the core, which is your transverse abdominis, the back wall of the core, which are your deep multifidus muscles, and the floor or the bottom of the core unit, which are your pelvic floor muscles. What we know is that if any one part of the core is compromised, it can cause the entire core unit to crash. And if the core unit crashes, then your client will suffer from potential injury and also a lack of performance. And the way you'll notice that is they won't be able to maintain balanced alignment as they move, or they'll feel pain. Predominantly back pain, but sometimes also shoulder and neck pain, and sometimes the pain can be referred into the lower part of the body. So what can affect the different parts of the core? The top of the core is the diaphragm. Anything that affects your client's breathing will influence the integrity of the top of the core unit. So those are things like having sinus problems, having allergies or hay fever, having had a history of a broken nose, having poor breathing, which can come from a habit of slumping in the body. Even if your client is suffering from a cold and has a bit of a cough, that can be influencing their breathing and consequently their diaphragm. Or if your client is under a lot of stress and suffering from anxiety, that can also influence their breathing. So that's the top of the core. So think about yourself. Do you have any of those things? And if so, in the 1, 2, 3, 4 core assessment, you'd give yourself 1 point for the top of the core. Let's go to the front of the core. What could possibly influence the transverse abdominis muscle? In women, we look at things like having had a cesarean section, or any type in males or females of abdominal surgery where they've had to cut through the abdominal wall can influence the integrity of the front of the unit. What else? A history of hernia, or whether it's been repaired or not repaired, or abdominal bloating. So if your client suffers from what we call bad guts, that can actually be causing the front of the core unit to blow out. Also, if your client is suffering from a gastric bug, that can be also influencing the front wall of the core. So if you have any of those things, you get another point. So you could potentially have 2 points at this point. The third part of the core is the back of the core, which are the deep multifidus muscles. Here we're looking at any type of spinal pathology, and it's important to understand that that has to be properly diagnosed. So if your client has ever been told by proper diagnosis through a physiotherapist, through the right kinds of scans, through a sports physician, that they have pathology in their spinal area, that would give them a point for the back of the core unit. And finally, the pelvic floor. What can influence that? In women, we're looking at things like vaginal births, especially if women have had episiotomies, but also things like menstruating can cause the pelvic floor to be weakened, a history of constipation or a history of hemorrhoids. All of those things can also influence the floor of the core. So your client could potentially have 4 points on the 1, 2, 3, 4 core assessment. The more points they have, the more likely their core is going to crash, and you're going to need to work hard to help them reestablish a good connection between their brain and their deep postural muscles.